So let me now move to welcome Ngozi Okonjo Iweala, our keynote speaker this morning. Ngozi is just an inspiration to everyone in the world, to those who want to lead in the future and to those who are already leading. You never need to mention Ngozi's whole name. You just say Ngozi at any international meeting and everybody smiles. And they look also a little bit chastened, a little bit like, I've got to up my game. And that's because, not just because she's an inspiring person, but because she has taken on serious, difficult tasks and forged a path that shows you really can make a difference. If you throw yourself in with real determination and real vision, you can make a difference. Ngozi has served twice in 2 different periods as finance minister in Nigeria. She's currently the finance minister of Nigeria. She served as managing director of the World Bank. She graduated from Harvard University and with her doctorate from MIT. And somehow, amidst all the pressures of not just running her own country's economy, but participating in many initiatives in global governance and with global institutions, she's also managed to produce a book. I hope she'll talk about that this morning, but her book, Reforming the Unreformable, has got to be a must-read for all of you. Ngozi, I'm so grateful that you're here. As well as your stellar career being an inspiration to us, let me just add, for those of you who ever go to speak in the future and you're feeling perhaps a little jet-lagged, that Ngozi has not only flown all the way to be with us here today, but she's flown all the way to be with us here today with malaria. It's not contagious, as she'll tell you straight away, but anybody else, I'm sure, in this room that was suffering from malaria would be lying in a bed feeling sorry for themselves. It's just classic Ngozi that she's here and she's still going to speak to us in spite of that. And Ngozi, you're an inspiration, and thank you.
Well, Naira, thank you so very much for that generous introduction. I always feel daunted when I'm introduced like that, because I don't know if I'll ever live up to it. But thank you. We've been friends for a long time, and I just want to congratulate you on this new school. I'm sure the Harvard MPP program is also looking to sharpen up, because there's more competition now. But I think it's absolutely wonderful that we have this new school of government. And of course, I've already met one of your students from my country, Temitope. So thank you for having me. I'm also delighted that you brought so many old friends. Paul is here, Elena. Jose Antonio is here from Old Wars. And several other people around the room. As people know, Jose Antonio and I campaigned together for the first really contestable election to be for World Bank president. And it was fun. Well, it lasted. So, I think since we're on very good friendly terms with Jim Yong Kim, and he's been absolutely wonderful. I've met with him. I don't know about you, Jose Antonio. And I think we can continue to expect good things from the World Bank. Now, let me, as Naira said, I have malaria, so I won't be my usual feisty self, but I'll do my best. Now, when I was asked to give this lecture, I was really tempted to just send a letter and say, read this book. Truth in advertising. First, it would save me from preparing a lecture. Second, it would mean many more people going on Amazon.com or wherever you go to get books. Because this tries to capture, as Naira said, it's hot off the press from MIT Press, what it really is like working with a team of talented people to try to reform a natural resource-based economy. And Paul was with us, Paul Collier, much of that way, rendering advice and supporting us. But I thought, well, I will extract some things from here, but I also have some other things that I want to say in addition, to take you through. So let me try to do that. I thank Naira Woods and the sponsors for this opportunity. And I'm going to talk on the challenge of managing natural resources in Africa, but with particular reference to Nigeria. The African continent, as you all know, is endowed with considerable amounts of natural resources. And in fact, not all of them have even been mapped. And a recent report of the African Development Forum finds that Africa ranks first or second in the world in the quantity of reserves of a vast array of mineral resources. And this is without complete mapping of what we have, all the way from oil and gas to bauxite, chromite, diamond, gold, you name it. Africa has it. Across the continent today, natural resource discoveries are happening almost every other day. In the past few years, the oil and gas map has changed considerably on the continent, in fact, in the world. As Ghana, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, all are discovering oil. So Nigeria and Angola are no longer the sole source of oil and gas as they were. We are now being joined. Guinea, which is ever so rich and in the eye of the storm now in terms of use of natural resources. But however, we all know that despite being blessed with this abundance of riches, the exploitation of these resources has not transformed the continent in the way it should, and many resource-rich countries remain poor. The Brazilian novelist Paulo Coelho once remarked that, quote, every blessing ignored becomes a curse. I think the same could be said of natural resource endowments. Every natural resource blessing which is mismanaged becomes a curse. It's not that natural resources themselves are a curse, but the way you manage them could either result in good things or bad things. I would like to argue in this keynote address that we should think differently about the management of natural resources in Africa. And in the end, I'll talk about obligations on both policymakers and also mining companies and others who participate in exploitation. We need to get the basic framework right if we are to ensure that resource-dependent countries, particularly in Africa, can build strong institutions and channel natural resource rents into productive investments. The effective management of natural resources on the continent is important to sustain the region's recent growth spurt. Naira mentioned the uncertain and dismal world economic environment, but there's one interesting story happening, that in the midst of this uncertainty, the slow growth in the Eurozone, or the contraction, dare I say, the slow recovery, fragile recovery in the US, Japan, and elsewhere, that the African continent for the first time has continued to grow robustly, I think is a story that has not really been well told. And this growth is happening on the back of good economic policies, that as this management of natural resource rents and natural resources has been going on, countries are beginning to learn. They still have not fully grasped, but they're beginning to put in some good policies. And that's why I'm hopeful that if we really push and we can help with building institutions, if Africa can continue to grow at better than 5% when other areas are contracting at this time, it means some lessons are being learned. And if we can learn further lessons, the continent will become the center of growth in the future. Now, the rest of my address is really structured in three parts. The first is I'd like to summarize some of the problems encountered in managing resource-dependent economies, drawing from the economics and political science literature, but also from, of course, our experience in Nigeria. And then I turn to some policy measures which may be implemented to tackle these problems, sharing with you personal experiences. And then the third part, I'll just try to identify a couple of broad lessons learned. I won't go into too much detail in that. Now, you look at the literature, both in economics and political science, and there are generally four things that people talk about as main challenges Commodity price volatility is a big one. The issue of natural resources as depleting assets. The issue of Dutch disease and limited economic diversification. The issue of corruption, weak governance in the management of natural resource revenues. Let me start with the issue of volatility, which is my favorite sort of issue, because this is what we found, interestingly, when we started managing the Nigerian economy. Commodity prices tend to be volatile, and consequently, resource-dependent economies tend to observe fluctuations in revenues, which are transmitted into the economy via the national budgets. When natural resource revenues are a substantial share of government revenues, the external volatility may result in significant fluctuations in public expenditures. In theory, revenue fluctuations should not lead to macroeconomic volatility if the government is able to smooth public expenditures by saving or borrowing. However, few resource-dependent economies in Africa have appropriate policies to mitigate the effects of volatile resource revenues. Consequently, fluctuations in revenues result in procyclical fiscal policy, which results in an unstable macroeconomic environment. We know from the economic literature that an unstable macroeconomic environment is harmful for growth, as it creates uncertainty which hinders planning by the private sector and reduces long-term private investments. This observation that macroeconomic volatility is correlated with low economic growth is not just simply an academic argument. It is real and well illustrated by the empirical findings from Nigeria. In 2003, during my first stint as finance minister, when we were asked to try to look at Nigeria and reform this economy, it was overwhelming. I remember sitting on my chair wondering what I had let myself in for. Everything seemed wrong. Didn't know where to start, but it was clear we had to do something. And I just thought I have to really absorb the path of economic growth, expenditures, budget management in this country to begin to understand what we're dealing with and how to reform. And when we sat down, we tried to look at a few things. And we tried to look at the national budget. We calculated the annual changes in oil revenues, annual changes in public expenditures, and plotted these against observed GDP growth. The results were astonishing, and I'd never really thought about it so much before, but I knew something was obviously wrong with the way this economy was being managed. We observed a strong correlation between changes in public revenue and expenditure and GDP growth. Indeed, some researchers have estimated that macroeconomic volatility may have cost Nigeria as much as 3.4 percentage points per annum in growth. And I want my favorite chart of all time to be put up. Where is it? Can you just, it's the only slide I have. I
just need to get underneath here.
Oh, okay. Can you? Can you see that? That's the famous chart in my book, and I think people in Nigeria are sick of seeing it. Because I think if you don't look at this, you will not understand what happened to the Nigerian economy. But you can see the volatility in public expenditures. When oil prices were high, everything was spent. When they were low, expenditures crashed. And sometimes the country could not even meet the salary bill. And you look at GDP growth mapped against it, you can see why, with this kind of volatility, the country was growing at an average of about 2% for a couple of decades, certainly below population growth with a negative per capita income growth. So this, for me, is a chart that really shows you how heavy the issue of volatility and the proper way of managing it is very important to get a grasp on. So this is the first problem, and I'd like to come back to it because for this problem, there's a solution, but I want to come back to what we did to try and tackle this in the next section. Now maybe you should we leave it up there, and then I'll come back. Let me just turn to the next issue, which is natural resources as depleting assets. The second challenge to bear in mind is that these resource endowments are depleting assets. In other words, These are exhaustible resources, and thus appropriate fiscal policy should aim at spreading resources over time so that government wealth, or the country's wealth rather, is preserved for future generations. This is a big issue. Essentially, the policymaker's problem is to convert one asset in the ground, the natural resource endowment, into assets above ground, financial and physical assets, such as infrastructure. This is the prudent way to ensure that natural resource incomes, or the financial assets obtained from such incomes, are consumed over a long period and adequately preserved for future generations. Failure to do this implies that countries simply become poorer. And this is what is happening in many African countries. It's very difficult for policymakers who have very short-term horizons to grasp this problem. Again, the empirical observations for many resource-dependent economies on the continent has not been that promising. Many countries have struggled to convert natural resource endowments into financial assets or physical assets. On the contrary, the expectation of income from natural resources has led to the accumulation of debt and supported wasteful public expenditures in some cases. In the case of Nigeria, the government in the 1980s and 1990s accrued substantial financial liabilities in the form of external debts to the Paris and London Club of Creditors. Indeed, by 2002, after 45 years of oil production, Nigeria had accumulated total external debt of about 40.5 billion. The total external and domestic debt of 40 billion or so, about 88% of GDP. And it was on this that we had to work so hard to be able to get written off the 30 billion by the Paris Club. That's another story. People thought it was impossible, but with the help of people like Elena, Paul, and so on, we worked really hard and we were able to tackle that. But it's just one way of not managing resources properly. There's the issue of Dutch disease and limited economic diversification. We're all familiar with this. And we know that natural resource-dependent economies tend to have overvalued exchange rates, which lower the competitiveness of their non-oil sectors, such as agriculture and manufacturing. Moreover, natural resource extraction often occurs in economic enclaves and results in limited job creation and, of course, lack of economic diversification. Nigeria is a prime example of many of these ills, but it's not the only one. The practical implication for the policymaker is that of increasing dependence on natural resource revenues as a source of government revenues and as a contributor to overall GDP. Again, consider the case of Nigeria. Oil was first successfully drilled by Shell in Oloibiri in 1956, followed by the first shipment of oil in 1958. At this point, the Nigerian economy was well diversified, deriving about 64% of GDP from the agricultural sector and 5% from manufacturing. And had it continued on that path, it would have had a much better economic base than it does today. Instead, what happened was that with the Dutch disease syndrome, agriculture lost its competitiveness and shrunk, and manufacturing from 5% shrunk to about 4%, and agriculture is about 40% of GDP today, down. In some cases, of course, if you read the literature, this is a natural occurrence, but the way it happened in Nigeria was more because of the issue of Dutch disease than with any evolution and true diversification of the economy. The issue of corruption and weak governance. Natural resource revenues create opportunities for rent-seeking activities and corruption that are enormous. To use an illustration that from microeconomics, I often say, and people don't like to hear this word, that natural resource discoveries tend to expand what I've termed the corruption possibilities frontier. They create more opportunities for rent-seeking, leakages in public expenditure, and the impact of such corruption is manifested in so many ways: inflated public works projects, diversion of spending from social projects such as health and education towards the types of projects that result in contracts and create room and opportunities for feedback. But I think the issue of corruption and weak governance is even worse than that. It's insidious. With a rent-seeking type of mentality and psyche that builds into society, this really attacks the moral fiber of people in society and creates an environment in which petty corruption and rent-seeking become the norm. So it's not just a large-scale corruption which you can target, but what it really does in creating in a society in which people think that, the best way and the quickest way to do well is to be a rent seeker. And that really attacks the very fabric of society. I'll come back to that. So how do you address some of these issues? I know you're all familiar. The issue is, what does a public policymaker do? Now, the measures to tackle the management of resource-dependent economies, a lot of work has been done by Paul and others, and I'll come to it. They are well known, delinking public expenditures from commodity revenues. But when I say they are well known, sometimes I step back. If they're so well known, why are they so little tried? It took us all of 40 or 50 years before we knew that we had to do something about this type of management. The practical implementation of some of the policies is often not straightforward and is very political. And that is why, even though the solution may be known, adoption of these policies is extremely important. And I'll illustrate with our example. The first thing we tried to do, which we did somewhat successfully in Nigeria, is to develop an oil price-based fiscal rule, which delinked the budgetary expenditures from the price of oil by adopting a reference benchmark oil price. Of course, countries like Chile have been doing this for copper, and there are other countries with good examples. What we just simply had not done it. We adopted this fiscal rule so that if oil prices, say for instance, the first time we did it was at about $35 per barrel, we'd adopt a benchmark price of, say, 25. At 55, we adopted 45. We didn't do this arbitrarily. We actually developed a model and looked at 10 and 5-year moving averages of oil prices. We worked with Wood Mackenzie and others to try to do this, and we got something that worked, that helped us sort of plug in an analytical way what type of benchmark price to put in. With this, we were happy to start this at a time when oil prices were rising. And I think that's also application of policy. You have to have some luck, and timing is everything. And we were able to do it when oil prices were rising. And you can see, if you look at this chart, there's a circle where you'll see from 2003 to about 2006, you see a little bump. That was when we put in the oil. You see how much smoother, how the volatility disappeared. And we have this little bump there. That's the excess oil savings that we were able to make by delinking the oil price. And we saved it in something called the excess crude account in Nigeria. At peak, we were able to save about $18 billion in this. In fact, even after we had used 12 billion of these savings in 2005-06 to retire, help us do an innovative buyback. So we got 18 billion written up by the Paris Club. We bought back 12 billion using our resources. And, it all resulted in a 30 billion write-off. And it all came from the little trick done there. It was a wonderful way of smoothing out our expenditures and our consumption. And it worked. But I tell you, in practice, it has been very difficult. Nigeria is a country that practices fiscal federalism, meaning that our constitution gives the states considerable autonomy in the use of fiscal resources. The constitution says that any resources earned into what is called the quote-unquote federation account belonging to the 3 tiers of government, federal, state, and local. We've got 36 states and the Federal Capital Territory, 774 local governments, and a federal government. The Constitution says in one section that the money must be shared immediately to all tiers. But in another section, Section 16, Section 162 says it must be shared immediately. Section 16 says the federal government shall manage the economy in the interest of the country. And these two sections given policymakers nightmares. If you go to Section 162, the governors argue that this excess crude account is not legal. because it says all the monies must be shared. So what are you doing saving this? And they've used it to take the federal government to court. And they take us to court, we look for an out-of-court settlement, they go back when they want more money, and we've been doing this dance. Because we try to embed this in the fiscal responsibility law. And the fiscal responsibility law was passed, but they refused to recognize it, saying that the Constitution overrides that, even though the Constitution authorizes our legislatures to make laws to try and help manage the economy. So you can see the mess. So sometimes you have a nice, neat economic solution, but you have a messy political solution. And because of this conflict, when we save money here in past times, they've often breached the rule of not using this and share this when the heat becomes too much. And what has happened is that this excess crude account is still there. It's the one mechanism that has endured. But during the peak of the economic and financial crisis in 2008, it was used in the very way we said that it should be used, which is to administer a fiscal stimulus to the economy. At times when other countries were going to the IMF and the World Bank to look for money, Nigeria didn't have to, because the Minister of Finance then, they were able to go into it, Mansour Mukhtar, and administer a fiscal stimulus to keep the economy going. So I feel very happy about that. But subsequent to that, they went into it a few times. By the time I came back as finance minister a year and a half ago, there was only 4.22 billion left in the excess crude account because the governors kept pushing to share this money. But since then, guess what? We've been able to save up to 9 billion now. So I feel very happy in just 1 year. So the mechanism is, now what have we also done? We said we cannot continue to have this thing under attack. So we've gone to develop a sovereign wealth fund. And it's been a fight. My predecessor as finance minister before I came back, Segun Aganga, took up this fight and was able to get a law approving a sovereign wealth fund. But once approved, launching it became another problem. But when I came in, we were finally able to launch it, starting with $1 billion, which has been agreed by all tiers of government. And the issue now is maintaining that. The federal government is determined to save a share of the excess crude in the sovereign wealth fund. So we are going to grow it. And instead of trying to force the states to automatically save in it, because we need it in order to keep this volatility in check, what we are going to do is make it voluntary. So those states that join the federal government will happily publish their names in the newspapers and say how much we've all saved. And those that don't will leave the citizens of the states to ask them why not. So that's the story of this implementation of this fiscal rule. And I think it's a very interesting one that continues to be very topical. Now, I could go and say more about the Sovereign Wealth Fund, but maybe in discussion. Let me just move. Let me say something more. Actually, it's a very interesting Sovereign Wealth Fund. Paul knows, because he's been advising us on it. It has 3 buckets. It has a stabilization window, an infrastructure window, which is unusual. It has a window that mandates investment in domestic infrastructure. And it has a future generations window. And the law assigns different percentages of funds to those 3 windows. And of course, the management of each window is going to be slightly different. The CEO whom we picked competitively, we advertised worldwide for the best Nigerian we could find. They've just mapped out the strategy for investment for each window, and it's quite interesting. And once the infrastructure window also begins to invest within the country, I think there'll be more belief and credibility in the power of this fund, and we'll be able to get more savings in. Now, the next issue is increasing the quantity and quality of public infrastructure investment. And first, on the volume of resources invested in infrastructure itself. A striking feature of our budget structure has been the large share of government spending allocated to recurrent expenditures rather than capital. diverting resources away from public investment in infrastructure, which is why it is critically important to have this window in the Sovereign Wealth Fund. When we started, when we left office in 2006, or when I left office in 2006, we had brought down the ratio of recurrent expenditures to capital to about 65-35 in the budget. It had been about 70 when we started in 2003, and we were able to bring it progressively down. Guess what? When I came back, I found that this had gone right back to 77%. Wage increases had been granted in the interim, 53% wage increase across the board for all civil servants. I don't want to go into detail, all sorts of pressures had been put, and the structure of the budget has gone back again, where much of this is not investing resources in good public infrastructure. So the fight is to reverse this. The president recognized that this needed to be reversed, and this is one of the tasks he gave me. Right now, we brought it back down to 68% for the 2013 budget, and the goal is to drive it back down. Ultimately, I'd like to see us at 60-40, but let us at least get to 65, hopefully by 2015, and this is more balanced. Actually, when I was looking at other countries, I thought surely Nigeria must be an outlier. There can't be many countries spending 70% of their budget on recurrent expenditures. And guess what? When I looked, please go and look it up, there are quite a few countries doing that. So this is an interesting thing which I had not been aware of until I tried to do this comparative work. But of course, what it means is that, you cannot build the type of, you cannot solve the deficiency in power, in roads, in bridges, things that are really needed if your economy is to take off. The quality of public spending is critically important, and quite apart from the amounts, making sure that quality expenditures are made is another very challenging task. You don't want bridges that collapse the next day, and with the issue of rent-seeking behavior and upping transactions costs, but for entrepreneurs who seek to do business, sometimes you find that corruption undermines the quality of public spending, because by the time people have paid the bribes, what they have left to put into actual building the road, we see this in Nigeria all the time. So we have to watch like a hawk, not just the quantum being spent, but the quality of the spending. It's become so bad at home now, only one company is trusted to deliver an infrastructure project. That's a company called Julius Berger, which is a Nigerian company with a German parentage. Their contracts are very expensive, but people know that when they finish the work, it will be solid and it will last. So we are getting to a point in the country where people say, no, don't even advertise, just give it to them, which is very bad. That again shows you how, your theory of how to do public procurement and bidding, which we painfully introduce, as you see in this book, in terms of trying to root out corruption, is now getting undermined because people just say, no, I don't want to hear about any other company. Just give it to them, and we know they'll do well. Perhaps the most important prerequisite for effective management of natural resources is to develop strong institutions. And the importance of institutions for economic development has been demonstrated since the 1970s. We all know the works, Douglas North. Recently, Acemoglu and Robinson, in this new book, Why Nations Fail, also provide several historical examples of how the development of inclusive institutions to secure property rights led to economic development in Western economies. For African countries managing natural resources, the biggest weakness is the issue of institutions. My personal prayer would have been that a country builds strong institutions before discovering natural resources. But of course, it doesn't happen that way. We've seen the examples in Norway and Botswana of countries that had strong institutions, in contrast to, say, Nigeria, where their natural resource endowments were well managed, well spent, the rule of law, property rights were all secure, and that has worked for them. For the purposes of managing natural resource revenues, a good institutional framework is, of course, provided by the work on the natural resource charters that Paul and others have done. If you haven't looked at it, please look. The Charter provides 12 principles which encompass the key economic and social dimensions of natural resource exploitation. I believe that by working through the framework, governments, businesses, and civil society in resource-dependent economies can engage more actively with the challenges of natural resource extraction. We have some initial benchmarking work by a panel of experts, which have been pulled together by Paul and others, to apply the Natural Resource Charter framework to Nigeria. And I really recommend this to other African countries. I think it's one of the things we can look at in this area of how to build institutions, manage the ramifications of natural resources. And I think we'll be working further with him and others to try and see how this can further help us in Nigeria. So thank you, Paul. You should be giving this lecture. Except you've not managed, actually, in a developing economy. So in Nigeria, we've made some progress. We adopted the 90, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, during the first time we were in office. We did other things. I forgot to bring you one little thing I like to share. It's a neat little thing. You know, each month we started this habit of publishing the revenues of each tier of government. So in Nigeria, people never used to know this famous thing that we share all revenues. People never knew how much their local government got in the month or their state. And so state governors would, the ones that were not straight, they would spend all this money somehow, and then they would say to people in their state that, oh, the federal government never disbursed any money. This is those federal people. And it was so exasperating. And, you know, I would go to a state to give a talk, and people would literally be attacking the federal government. So I came from one of those sessions last, and I said to President Obasanjo, then we've got to do something. Can we publish what each of these states and local governments get? And he said, yes, we'd never done it. So from 1st of January 2004, we began to publish these. And we published them steadily, and I think it was one of the most exciting things people told me that we ever did. Imagine just publishing numbers. And we would compile them in what I call the most boring bestseller ever. Just numbers. Just numbers. And we can't keep enough of these. When I left government, they stopped. We've taken it up again. So I don't know how to institutionalize this because I'm not going to be in government forever. I can't wait to get a good night's sleep. But how do we make this thing, how do we codify this so that subsequent governments will be forced? Because we are doing it again, and it's so exciting. People come for the books, just numbers, just to see over a year how much they get, so that the governor or the local government councillor cannot tell them. And they can ask them questions. How come there are potholes? You said you didn't get money, but this shows you got, 10 million naira for this local government last month. Information is power. And this little thing alone has been one strong institutional mechanism to keep a little bit in check I'm not saying it does it all, but it at least puts a little bit of fear in people that what they are doing is not completely in the dark. But building institutions is an ongoing process, and we continue to seek ways. As I said, we'll be working with Paul to try and improve on some of these things. We face new challenges. Which I'll talk about in building institutions, because for each new thing we introduce, you find that without strong rule of law and strong institutions, some good policies are often difficult to manage. So let me just, I'm coming to the end, but let me just mention a couple of things I think broadly we need to look at for developing countries. One is sort of, for advice to policymakers, and it's more in the realm of political economy, psychology, I don't know what to call it. Because we have a pernicious problem. When you have a natural resource dependent economy, expectations are very different. The expectations of the citizens have to be managed, because these things come in and people think we're rich. And that's the way that natural resource policymakers in natural resource dependent often paint it. We've discovered something. And everybody thinks we're rich. So now we must have this, we must have that, we must have the other. And because the weak institutions and lack of trust in government, policymakers often give in and build in a series of entitlements, which in the long run are not sustainable. So you build in, everybody in these oil-rich countries thinks that we must have petrol at very subsidized prices, or at zero if possible. And you can see in country after country that this petroleum subsidies are heavy. Not only I'm not saying it's only natural resource dependent, but it's a key feature of these economies. People expect all sorts of entitlements, low electricity prices, low this, low that. And over time, these entitlements are built in. Now, for these countries discovering natural resources, the first thing I would say to their policymakers is, do not present it as the country has come onto this big windfall or this big rich set of riches. Because you build up unrealistic expectations which you cannot manage over time. Now, we are a classic example of that. Because trust is also low in government. I know they've done a survey, Gallup, and trust is low in every government all over the world, including the UK, by the way. But it's very low in Nigeria as well. And, so people feel, give me this petroleum subsidy. That's what I can get from this government. There's corruption. There's policymakers are not doing well. So give me what I can get. So over time, we built in these subsidies that are costing us almost 5% of GDP, $13 billion at peak. And of course, we cannot sustain those. But you can see what happened to us. We've tried over time in this country, one way or the other, to roll back the subsidies. And it's not been an easy thing to do. You roll them back, they creep back in because labor is out on the street. Well, when this last time, recognize that the subsidies have grown to an enormous level. And I'll come to that because we found out that in this growth was also some corruption that had crept in to the subsidy scheme. But in any case, $13 billion unsustainable. We tried 1st of January 2012 to roll back these subsidies. Now there's a story within a story here. We had actually started communicating with the population. We had started campaigns to educate and to communicate and to let them know that we had in mind a series of social safety nets that would cushion the impact of withdrawing the subsidy. And we had begun very successfully. We were supposed to continue these campaigns for another 2 to 3 months before finally announcing the subsidy. And the first public televised town hall we did was highly successful. So everybody was elated. And then we went away for Christmas. I think we did it 3rd or 4th of December. I can't remember. I think it was the 20th of December. We went away agreeing that as soon as we came back in January, we'd do another one February, another one March, and then finally we would try to bring in. And what happened? I'm still thinking through it. I was in Washington with my family when I got news that the phase-out was going to be announced in a couple of hours. So I think some enemies of reform who really wanted to torpedo the whole process managed to convince the president to go for it and to go immediately at this time. And he did. And you see the consequences of what happened. It was a very difficult period. I think if we had had the time, we were not so stupid. People keep coming to me and saying, well, why didn't you communicate? We did. We had a plan. We had developed social safety nets, even with the help of the World Bank. We had it all laid out, money for maternal mortality, conditional cash transfers, vocational training, maintenance and repair of major roads, things that Nigerians could see, things we were going to implement before, then saying, look, we are phasing this out. But we were never allowed. And I think some people saw that if this could succeed, reforms would have the day. I think so. This is the first time I'm sharing this, by the way, so keep it to yourself. Perhaps people were fed up with this set of reformers, coming back again. And there was a need to torpedo the work. And they almost did, but not quite. We went out, we fought, and the president was very brave. practically under siege. He still insisted that he would not roll back the whole thing. So we were able to roll back by 50%, which no other government had succeeded in doing for the past 6 or 7 years before. They'd not even dared. So in the end, it was a brave gain. The population felt this, the president had listened. We felt that we had gotten at least something out of it. We didn't get the whole thing, but we got part of it. And it was a good lesson. Another one, it's not in this book. We'll have to put it somewhere else. In watching out when you're doing reforms. We'll come back to that. So let me just say that, when you build in, my main point really was that the mindset of your population and the mindset on entitlements has to be managed, because when you give into that, you're giving into a whole set of issues which you'll not be able to deal with. So today, we've rolled back subsidies by 50%. We've managed to get cost-reflective electricity tariffs, and this time we were allowed to do it properly. We communicated well. We developed cross-subsidies between well-off consumers, industry, and the poorest consumers who don't pay anything, and it was accepted. There was no noise about it, and we were able to do that. I think it was less visible than petroleum subsidies, and we were able to get away with that. Now, finally, let me just talk about another set of advice. First was to policymakers. This next is to industry and firms investing in developing resource-rich countries. And I just want to say that there are a whole set of things to also observe, because the landscape for investment is changing worldwide. Civil society is much more active. And it is going to continue to be the case that a lot of pressure will be put on firms and industry investing in natural resources to be more transparent, more open. I want to just say a few things that I said to the Chinese Mining Association. I was invited 2 years ago to speak to the Chinese Mining Association, and with the chair, Li Keqiang was the chair of the meeting, the present premier. And I was wondering, why have they invited me to do this? And I was very hesitant. But then I thought about it and I said, this is a golden opportunity to share. Of course, going to China, the Chinese Mining Association, when I entered the hall and saw 4,000 people as members, it was really daunting. But nevertheless, I gave them a very simple message. It's for all firms. It's not just for Chinese firms. First thing is to remember that these natural resources, you can't take them away. They're there in the ground. And so you must think of investment in this in a slightly different way than you would with things you can take away. That means you must think of the communities you work in and the country much more consciously. And I gave them 5 very simple-minded principles of investment, which is to make sure that first you align your investments with the country's development priorities. You should no longer come in with a mindset of extraction, but asking yourself, where does this really fit in the longer-term scheme of things of the development of this country? Practice transparency. Exchanging contracts for infrastructure, exchanging natural resource exploitation for building infrastructure gives a feeling of an opaque approach to doing business and always makes populations suspicious. So try to be as transparent in terms of the contract that you're negotiating as you possibly can. If you're not, new governments will surely overturn those contracts, and you will either lose money or lose time. The third is add value. Don't just think in terms of extracting the commodity. The world is changing. Many countries, African countries in particular, are looking at value chains, at creating jobs. They are no longer ready to export their jobs to other countries. And invariably, when you do not do this, you encounter difficulties. The fourth is to pay what is due and do what is right. It's important for foreign firms in particular, but all firms, to pay what is due and to avoid tax evasion and other practices avoid paying bribes. I mean, in this bribe taking and corruption, we never talk of corruption in the private sector. You know, when you talk of corruption, people automatically jump to the public sector. And my president often says this. Who are the bribers also? Where do they come from? What about corruption in the private sector? And I said to them, try to avoid this and all these practices, because in the end, if you're found out, it's going to set you back. And now we see what is happening with tax evasion. Britain is going to us, George Osborne announced yesterday, £5 billion from Swiss banks. Starbucks has to pay because of tax evasion. Now, if they're doing this in a country with strong institutions like the UK, can you imagine what they're doing in African countries? Paul has promised me we are going to go on a drive to try to get what is right in our own countries with respect to these issues of tax evasion, transfer pricing, and so on. But this is one of the things I told them. And fifth, engage with local communities. Train focus on human capital in these countries. Train the local people. Don't bring your own people in. Look at the conditions. I didn't know that there was going to be a riot in South Africa, but I was telling them, you cannot be investing in a country and your people are living in a compound, like we have the Shell compound in Nigeria, in splendor or relative splendor, when next door in the village where you're exploiting the resources, the people have no water, no power, and so on. What will happen? We saw what happened in South Africa. People explode. Did you see where they were living on television compared to, how these people live? I didn't know about this, but this is what I tell you. Pay attention to your workers and the local community. Some very simple-minded principles. So not only for policymakers, but also for investors in countries. In these natural resources, we have to think of principles, of participation, of implementation. So in conclusion, let me also quote the American novelist Elizabeth Gilbert, that you have to participate relentlessly in the manifestation of your own blessings. Perhaps the same charge can be put to resource-dependent economies, to work towards realizing their natural resources as blessing. I want to repeat that natural resource endowments don't have to be a curse. The absence of institutions, the absence of proper management of the political economy, all these can result in making natural resources a curse. But if you put these things in place, they can be a very important blessing. I'm optimistic. I think the world is changing. I think we can get it right. And I think that ultimately, natural resource endowed economies on the continent will do better. Thank you very much.
Ngozi would like to take a couple of quick questions or comments from you. So can I just take the first couple that would like to ask a question or make a very quick comment? Open to you all. Nick Lovegrove.
Mr. I'd be very interested in your reflections, having been back in Nigeria for 18 months and pursuing the strategy you're pursuing, of what changes you would like to see at the World Bank.
I'll take all three and then I'll come back.
Okay.
Further question? Don Markwell.
Could you say more, please, about how to avoid or overcome the Dutch disease?
Any other question? I'm told I can take one more.
Can you repeat the second question?
So the second question was, how do you overcome Dutch disease? The 30-second kind of recipe, I think, is what we're being asked for. Monica Toft.
Yeah, given your insight now, thinking about the reform and how you think it might have been circumscribed by some opponents in the government, you talked about sort of the population and trying to make sure that you manage the expectations of them. What are some ideas for managing the opposition and government bodies that might sort of stand in your way as you're trying to push forward these reform efforts?
So how do you deal with the opponents of reform? Ngozi.
Thank you very much. Three very good questions. Let me just I'll end with changes. The first question last. Let me tackle the first two. I think on the issue of the Dutch disease of evaluation of exchange rates and the consequences, I think technically as economists we know what to do. And some countries have done it very successfully. I think what you have to be, let me just step back and say this. When natural resource endowments come into being, policymakers do not often think in the way that you're talking. They focus most on, we've got this, we've got more money to spend, and so on. But if you were to think in the framework of, we've got these resources, which we've got to invest in expanding the economic base of the country so that we can really diversify the country, then you think, what does this mean? How do we get prices in the economy right? All we're saying is you've got to get prices right, meaning that you cannot allow a situation in which agriculture, for instance, if it was your basic industry, is now completely, neglected because you're allowing the price of your currency, of your exchange rate to go up, militating against agriculture, militating against exports, and encouraging imports into the economy. So you've consciously got to put in place mechanisms for managing prices and making sure that the prices in the economy are right. And that's that's the first thing I can think of. Second, you've got to find a way to manage the extra resources and liquidity. It's all part of the same coin that come into the economy. And the thing to do is, rather than let this go into wasteful spending and into the hands of people who are corrupt, is to invest heavily in infrastructure, in power, in roads, and so on. That way, you continue to provide a basis for manufacturing, for agriculture, for housing, for the rest of the economy. And that's really the way. But the thing is that politicians who come in and policymakers, I think they need to get a lesson in this. It does not come automatically. And I often think that all these countries that are discovering oil and gas, maybe the Blavatnik school or some need to really visit and take them. Don't assume that they are consciously thinking of these issues. I think Ghana is doing a bit better than Nigeria. They've learned some lessons from us. The bad lessons of what not to do. And some of the recent techniques that we've used. Actually, I get a lot of calls from finance ministers of other countries asking me questions of what we've done. So those would be two things that I would think about. And countries, Norway did it, so it's a very prime example to look at. Malaysia did it. We can find very good. Chile is a wonderful example with copper, Now, dealing with vested interests and reform opponents and the opposition, it's a very difficult thing. It varies country by country, so I don't have an overall prescription. But one thing is true. If you embark on reform which we did the first time, without consciously thinking, what does success look like? Who are going to be the opponents of this reform? What tactics will they use? But even look at this recent one. You just can't figure it out. Sometimes they'll work with you like they're supporting you. Why don't you do it now? We want this. And when you look carefully, they're really trying to torpedo things. So I think the only advice I can give myself and others is you must, for each reform you want to do, try to do a better and more careful analysis of who are the winners and who are the losers. And you know, if the population at large are the winners, you must do more work to get them on your side first. Spend the time to communicate, which is what we were trying to do on the subsidy phaser. Spend the time. It is worth it. Because if you can get the population to see that this thing really benefits them, they will be able to help you fight the losers. The second principle is to try and convince the losers that they are not really losers at all. That this economy will work better for everyone and they'll make even more money, although they'll have to work a little harder for it, which some of them don't want to do. But we've managed in some cases to convince some of the vested interests that ultimately they will benefit. Those are two things I would say. Then I think changes I would like to see at the World Bank. Let's ask Jose Antonio. Look, my take on this is the president is in place. I've listened to him at the World Bank annual meetings. He gave a very passionate speech about what he wants to do to change the bank and to help developing countries. It was a convincing speech. I think we should give him a chance to see his vision through before we make judgments. Thank you.
I know I speak on behalf of all of you, and just saying a huge thank you to Ngozi Okonjo Iweala. We're enormously proud and privileged to have you on the International Advisory Board of the Blavatnik School of Government. And I think your discussion this morning spells out exactly why that's the case. Thank you so much, Ngozi. So just thank you one more time for Ngozi.